Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are in yet another conversation session on social contracts for economies of the future. The world today is more unequal than it was pre-pandemic. How can social contracts help bridge inequalities in the new world? To discuss all this and more, we have with us Ms. Baroness Minouche Shafiq, Director, London School of Economics and Political Science, who's joined us virtually. Mr. Hideki Mori, the World Bank Group India Mission, who's here with us on the dais. And in conversation with them is Mr. Sanjeev Bajaj, President CII and Chairman and Managing Director of Bajaj FinServ Limited. So over to you. Please take the conversation forward.
I'm Ms. Shafiq, who's joining us virtually. Mr. Mori, friends, good afternoon. A special welcome to a very distinguished and eminent expert for this session. Baroness Shafiq, a leading economist, philosopher, and an expert in public policy, is currently serving as director of the London School of Economics and Political Science. We look forward to hearing her soon. We are also delighted to have with us Mr. Mori, the World Bank's Operations Manager for India. Before I invite our eminent guests to speak, let me take a few minutes talking about social contracts. The social contract, as we understand, is an agreement either explicit or implicit amongst members of society to cooperate for particular social benefits. It could mean a contract where one sacrifices some part of individual freedom to get state protection. It could be a contract between an employer or an employee for benefits, etc. Now, keeping in mind that we are in a post-pandemic world, is this the right time and the right driver to review the kind of social contracts that one must have in a country like India? It goes without saying that the COVID-19 pandemic has significantly altered the economic and social strata of our society. Unfortunately, the pandemic has amplified many of the pre-existing problems that a growing, developing country like India faces. Chief amongst them is deepening inequalities between the haves and have-nots. We also have to keep in mind that from our 75th year of independence, we are now planning for a new India through a period of Amrit Kal over the next 25 years to grow into the position of a developed economy, led by the Honorable Prime Minister's 15th August speech. All of India needs to drive towards this. But it also means then that as we are going through this period of transformation, it once again requires us to review our social contracts. The government itself proactively worked on this through the pandemic. For example, both the financial support scheme and the food grain scheme available to the lower income strata of society was driven very effectively by the government through this period. Or the emergency credit line scheme that was made available to MSMEs in a period where the businesses shut down for no fault of theirs, they could not make payments, they could not buy stuff. This was of tremendous benefit. The Prime Minister, as I mentioned earlier, on 15th of August, talked about the Panch Pran, or the 5 pledges involving social transformation and reconstruction. The whole idea was to bring the common man at the forefront to say that if India develops, our society must develop and our inequalities must reduce. But I won't speak about this more because we've got experts in this field. And let me first start off by inviting Mr. More to speak.
Thank you very much, Sanjeev, and good afternoon, everybody. And Minish, probably you don't remember me, but I clearly remember you. And because I was a very junior staff, and it's a very humbling experience to speak in front of you and then to speak in front of you. And so let me see that India has been the brain of the World Bank, Ministry included, and then also I have worked with so many the bright Indian colleagues and bosses. So, but let me get into that social contract issues. So, how can social contract help bridge inequalities and in the new world? I think this is the topic, right? And then the World Bank has a tendency to define social contracts like the following: a dynamic agreement between state and society on their mutual roles and responsibilities. It's kind of the academic definition, but if you untangle it, somewhat you're going to have to think about 3 elements of it. One is process, how formal and informal bargaining mechanisms mediate civil and state interest and capabilities, number 1. Second thing is outcomes. To what extent that the deliberate inclusive development. And then number 3 is resilience, and to what extent they are supportive and to the aligned citizen expectations. Now, if you think about the journey of a country like India to a growth and shared prosperity, and it's useful to think and analyze beyond technical policies. And then because that would, we need to understand how power dynamics and citizen-state relationship happened. And I think I'm overstepping my area of expertise, because I think it's, again, I'm looking at the screen and the Minush contemplating that, she's a political scientist, and then this is a topic of political science rather than the economics of operations. But I think it's very important. And then the social contract lens is going to help very much about how to help diagnose the constraints, and then also explain complex development challenges like inequalities, poor service deliveries, weak institutions, outbreaks of unrest, and identity opportunity for improving outcomes. Now, there are some good examples of social contracts between the state and citizens in India. And then one is cooperative and competitive federalism that your political system goes through, with an increasing role of the states. I think this delivery of social contract or following through the contract is becoming very, very important at the state level. At the national level, there have been several rights-based approach. And one of them is the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act of 2005. We call it NREGA. And then before becoming operations manager, we worked in a sector called social protection. And if you're in social protection, if you don't know NREGA, you're kind of fake. This is a world famous program that India should be proud of. And the second example is the 2009 Rights of Children Free Compulsory Education Act. Now, the one key set of indicators, reforms to strengthen governance systems in the way to institutionalize mechanisms for effective civil bargaining is maybe shifting the discussion from upstream public finance management reform to engaging at the point where government and citizen interact service delivery at the local level. And then the challenge is that India is a very complex country. It's almost like having 34 different countries in one single country. It's very, very humbling. And many of the states are bigger than my own. And so I know that I understand the complexities. But having said that, it's important to analyze the capacity and effectiveness and the responsiveness across sectors and ministry at the central level is important. The relationship between states and the federation, the basic union government, and even at the level of city and panchayat and local government level. I think it's very, very important to see the dynamics of what matters. And then addressing the challenge of quality services infrastructure will require a stronger decentralization, deconcentration, and then probably, everybody wants to change right away, but because of complexity, it's not that easy to do. So we're going to have to do the measured approach of incremental and adaptive approach is probably kind of important expectations, realistic expectations. Now, these are the sort of background, but let me get into some World Bank is working in this area. And we have a thing called country partnership framework. That is every international organization has a framework strategy, and it's a thick document. And not many people actually read it, and that's another story. But the three priorities that we have identified. It's that in our analysis shown that India first could use its own resources. You have tremendous human resources, tremendous natural resources, and then your human capital potential is incredible. And that I don't think India has been using it to its maximum advantage. The second thing is that India could foster inclusiveness for both poverty reduction purposes and also growth purposes. Poverty reduction is important. Your private businesses, right? The poor people cannot consume. If they cannot consume, then your business is going to grow. And the third thing is that India could strengthen the agility and performance and also responsiveness of a public sector institutions. Our lending program, we are a bank, so we lend money, but we also provide technical assistance, policy advices, and I think those are guided by those three thinkings. Now, let me shift the talk to what has been happening. Then I started working in India almost in the middle of Delta, and then so it was traumatic experience in the beginning that our office lost like yours have several people, and then it was really, really bad. And then the pandemic is kind of over, but other things are gaining even more problematic side. Climate change is happening. Urbanization. India is going to be very urbanized country in pretty soon. So if the world continues like this, the pressure on citizens is going to lead to further societal division possibly and discontent. And then, but these may be eased up if the social contract management can provide people with insurance or coping mechanism for the risks. And then more specifically, I'm going to get into this, my area of sort of interest, so-called human capital, education, health, and social protection. This was one of the discussion topic that I was given to us. Now, let's talk about education first. In education, globally, after 2 years, learning loss has been horrendous. And then many students in the world lost nearly 2 years of schooling. And then students from disadvantaged groups, like sometimes those are women, tribal youth, minority communities, and those with some health issues are very, very vulnerable to those shocks. And then the recent study, I think, is coming from Annual Status of Education Report, so that there was a 4 percentage point increase in dropout between age 6 and 10. And then also, another report shows that in India, estimated 82 to 90% of students have lost at least one ability in language and mathematics across all grading levels. It's horrendous. And expected years schooling may drop by the factor of 1.4 years. Learning adjusted years of schooling could fall by nearly 2 years. Now, if you amount all the kinds, the estimate says that costing of typical student in India for the annual impact future of the average annual earning is about, I don't think it can be so precise, but the number that I was given is $614. And then if you multiply that with number of students that you have, it's almost US dollars, $1.2 trillion the value loss in the lifetime income levels by students. It's huge. And then the challenge was also multiplied the fact that only 24% of Indian household has access to internet. And then I know that the digital technology has been key, but many people only have smartphone at the best, not the computers, not the tablet. It's a huge disadvantage. Now, health. During the pandemic, everybody was paying attention to the COVID-19, but the health routine checkup dropped about 25%. And then government has been combating with several the national programs, Pradhan Mantri Health Infrastructure Mission, very, very impressive one. And then also there's a National Health Protection Mission as well. And so the issue is going up, but I think access to health services, health services is going to remain to be very, very big challenge. Now, finally, and let's go into social protection. And then I used to have a boss from India who was the director of social protection in the World Bank Group. And he said that social protection, as a matter of fact, is a social contract between the society, government, and its bond. So let's say that that 90% of Indian workforce is informal. and without access to significant savings or workplace-based social protection benefits, such as paid sick leave or social insurance. And then also, being informal or no-time access, they don't have, the benefits are not portable. And then once you change the job, if they have any benefit, it all dropped. It cannot be done. So therefore, their life is much, much riskier. And then Government of India, as a matter of fact, launched a very impressive response to COVID-19 that the MSME you talked about, and then also there was a strengthening of safety net payment mechanisms. But I also highlighted, pandemic also highlighted structural weakness of the Indian social protection systems. Because one is that its system is very fragmented. And then largely based on schemes, different schemes, and so it doesn't have a consolidated institutional coordinations. And then in addition, as a group, the youth and women are facing probably the biggest risk that you're going to imagine. And that spending happen to be vulnerable to begin with. And then we are learning that the people increasingly demanding basic social protection, they call it social protection floor, that minimum matters. And then when they're unemployed, and then what's going to happen if they have the opportunity to retrain, or assurance that they and their children will still get access to good education, health, and jobs. They are very, very, very serious issues, concerns, and the climate change and other pressure is mounting. So again, social contract lens is quite important to be able to analyze and help strategize the future of your economic growth. Now, let me end my initial talk with 4 questions. And as the economy urbanizes and aging happens, the accelerating climate change and technological change, and the trade-offs. And then the first question is, should infrastructure investment be partially oriented toward those strictly economic benefits, or you have to think about broader consequences? The second question that I have, and that this is for you all, and because I don't really know the answer to myself, but how can the government balance a focus on the poorest of the poor and with the need to support growing vulnerable but urban middle class? Urban middle class are not necessarily the poorest of the poor. Your poorest of the poor is rural. But when the resource constraint happens, how are you going to do it? Number 3, that when implementing these projects, should early emphasis on the pocket on effectiveness that can have positive demonstration effects, or in lagging areas. So scale matters, also like a long-term, short-term trade-offs have to be think about. And then the last, do targeted intervention, meaning that because of the resource constraint, because if you have safety net payment, somebody has to pay for it, and it comes from taxpayers' money, one way or the other. So when you have resource constraint, do targeted intervention to support job creation, enrich vested interest. And then once again, I think that those are the important questions for not for the government as well, but also you are working with the government, and perhaps that in your dialogue, because in some ways the social contract has to be two-way street. You are part of the social contract. And then and you are concerned about your family, your employers, consumers, and then you have the responsibility and opportunity to express your views to the government so that India as a society becomes better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mori, for covering a wide variety of topics and including certain challenges and choices that as a society we need to make. With that, let me now invite Baroness Shafiq to deliver her address. Over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be speaking to the Confederation of Indian Industry. The choices that Indian industry makes over the decades to come will have huge consequences for the world. And so this is a very timely moment to be thinking about the future of the social contract in India. The previous speakers have outlined what is meant by the social contract. So I'm going to jump into the issues of why I think it's broken and how it needs to change. I should qualify by saying when I talk about the social contract, I mean the contract within our societies that can be delivered by families, communities, employers, or the state. And in more traditional societies in many parts of India, much of the social contract is delivered by families. If you get sick, if you're unemployed, if you need to invest in your education, that is provided traditionally by the family. But over time, what tends to happen in most countries as they grow and become richer, the market and the state play a much greater role in providing both social insurance and investment in the population. So why do I think the social contract is broken? I think there are two main reasons. One is that, well, let me describe the traditional social contract. Until very recently, it was built on the premise that families would have a primary male breadwinner, that women would take care of the young and the old. There was a presumption that people would stay married until they died and give birth to children only in marriage. They'd have steady employment with a few employers over the course of their career, and the education and skills that they accumulate in school would be enough to last a lifetime. And most people would live just a few years after they'd retired, and the care that they needed in old age would be provided by their family. That's what traditionally we all thought of as the social contract. Now, as I've described that, you're probably thinking a lot of that has become irrelevant. Today, women are increasingly employed in the labor market. In fact, globally, more women go to university than men. The rates of divorce in society are going up. The average worker has many more jobs in the course of a lifetime, and the rise of the so-called gig economy means that many people will work for several employers in a week, much less a lifetime. And in developing countries, there's still many people working in the informal sector, but that is also becoming an issue as we think about where benefits should be provided. I think the biggest disruptors of the social contract have been the changing role of women, who are increasingly employed in the labor force and are therefore not available to care for the young and the old for free, and technology, which has fundamentally changed work and education and what we need from our educational systems. So let me give you a couple of examples of how I think the current social contract is failing us and what a better one would look like. And if you're interested in more detail, much of this is described in much greater detail in my book called What We Owe Each Other. But let's think about education. We have made huge progress. Countries like India have now achieved virtual universal primary education and gender parity in education and are making quick progress on secondary education. But we also know from huge amounts of research that the shape of our educational system is probably wrong. Our current social contract says education occurs roughly from the age of about 5 or 6 until late teens, early 20s. And yet research shows that the biggest improvements in social mobility occur before children ever get to school. Those first 1,000 years of life, where if children don't get adequate nutrition and mental stimulation, they will never catch up, no matter how good a school you send them to. And so we need to think much harder about how our educational system can work and deliver for those early years. We also know that people are living much longer. Life expectancy in India has gone up massively, and that means that people are going to have to work much longer if they're going to be able to afford retirement. And yet our educational system is designed to more or less stop in the early 20s. And so I would argue that a better social contract to achieve both social mobility and continuing improvement of skills through longer careers would have a different shape. It would start earlier and it would last much, much longer. Let's turn to the issue of employment. One of the most striking things about modern labor markets is that informality, which we used to associate mainly with developing countries, has become a feature everywhere. I often say that the gig economy is just a very cool name for the informal sector. And these more flexible contracts have accommodated more diverse workers, and technology has made it possible for firms to outsource more activities, and COVID showed us even more what was possible. And that flexibility has had huge benefits for employers and for consumers, who now are able to get services which were not possible in the past. But for those who are employed on flexible contracts, and for those employed in the informal sector, while they may have jobs they might not otherwise have had, they have to live with great insecurity about their incomes, their hours of work, what happens when they're sick or old. And we saw the consequences of this during COVID, when informal sector workers probably suffered the most, often unable to quarantine, for example, when they were ill, because otherwise they wouldn't earn an income. I would argue that a better social contract would retain the benefits of flexibility while providing workers with more security in the form of mandatory benefits for all workers, generous unemployment insurance, and opportunities to retrain throughout life. Many countries have adopted such a model, particularly in the Nordic world, where it's often called flexicurity, where you have very flexible labor markets. Workers can be dismissed with very short notice. They don't get severance pay, but it's actually the rate of labor turnover is very high in those countries. But it's not a problem, because when those workers are unemployed, they get unemployment insurance, which more or less is very close to their previous wage, so their living standards don't fall. They're very quickly put into reskilling and retraining programs, and they're very quickly back in work. And I think that's a much better social contract for the future, and one in which India has some huge advantages. I think my previous former colleague from the World Bank mentioned the Employment Guarantee Scheme, which provides a floor for workers in India. And it's not linked to a specific employer, which I think is also very interesting. In many countries, pensions, for example, because we know workers move from one job to another, pensions have become portable. It seems to me that we should be thinking of a world in which all benefits become portable. And if you work for 3 employers in a week, why can't each employer contribute a little bit to your sick pay, to your pension, to your training costs? Especially because of the ID program in India, it's possible digitally to be able to keep track of that. And so you could imagine a world where you have flexibility, but portable benefits for all workers, whether they're in the formal sector or the informal sector or on flexible contracts. So let me just leave you with 3 principles that I think would guide a better social contract for the future. One is that you should provide minimum security for all, a floor below which no one can go. I'm not keen on universal basic income, which some people argue for, but I think that minimum would look a little bit like India's employment guarantee scheme, where everyone would be guaranteed a minimum below which they wouldn't have to go further. The second principle would be maximum investment in opportunity and capability. There is too much talent wasted in countries that are unable to invest in all parts of the population. One of my favorite pieces of research that I cite in my book is called Lost Einsteins. And they look at children who happen to be born in poor families and in poor communities in the United States. And what they find is that controlling for mathematics and science ability, so these are children who have the same ability in year 4 at school, what happens to them when they are adults? How much do they earn, and how much do they become innovators and have actual patents that they register? And what they find is that if you happen to be born into a poor family, you're 10 times less likely to have a patent and be an innovator. If you happen to be born in Silicon Valley, you're 10 times more likely than anyone else to have a patent and be an innovator. And they argue that if we could equalize opportunity across our societies, and so that these children who have equivalent ability were able to fulfill their potential, these lost Einsteins would quadruple the rate of innovation and productivity in our economies. Just imagine how many lost Einsteins there probably are across India. My third principle would be sharing risks better. I think we've created a sort of an economic system where too many risks are being borne by individuals that could more efficiently be borne by others or managed collectively. For example, healthcare and health insurance is something that obviously is better managed collectively. And of course, India has begun to roll out a massive national health insurance scheme. Similarly, pensions are another good example like that, where if you automatically enroll everyone in a pension scheme, that results in a much more efficient pension system because you're sharing risks among a much bigger population and reducing the costs for everyone involved. So let me just say one more word about the social contract with business. I think there are some very important changes that can be made. I mentioned already the idea of portable benefits and delinking benefits from being a specific employer. I think that only works if businesses pay their fair share of tax. And rather than taxing labor so much as is done in India, which makes hiring people unattractive, firms would pay tax on their profits, but then you would have a system of benefits which is linked to the employee rather than the employer. And I think that is potentially a very innovative and interesting way forward. Let me close. What I believe a new social contract is not necessarily about higher taxes and more redistribution and a bigger welfare state. It is about a fundamental reordering and equalizing of the distribution of opportunities and security in our societies. The result of this would be higher productivity, more efficiently sharing risks around things like childcare, health, work, and old age, and reducing anxiety and insecurity in our societies. Financing that requires thinking much more creatively about how we tax business and how we tax employers, and thinking about how to invest much more creatively in an educational system that lasts from cradle to grave. I think we owe each other much more than our current social contracts can deliver. I think India is on the cusp of really rethinking its social contract in many interesting ways and has some very interesting building blocks on unemployment insurance, healthcare, and education, and could really develop a model of a social contract that provides both greater security, but also greater opportunity for the vast number of people in India who could benefit from a more generous and inclusive social contract. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Baroness Shafiq, for those words and explaining to us key elements from what you said are explained in more detail in your book. We have time for a few questions, and if I can start by asking you the first question, and that revolves around gender inequality. You talked about how the basic societal contract, like in many other parts of the world, is changing in India as well. And women play a very key role, not only because they are half of our population, but because it can also be a huge dividend going forward. What do you think are some of the key things that, whether as government, industry, society, we need to be doing, particularly in India, towards reducing this gap in gender inequality?
Yeah, well, you're quite right that it is a huge economic issue. You know, if you look at the United States in the period of rapid growth from the 1950s to 2000, when the US economy really boomed, you can explain between 20 to 40% of the productivity gain in the US economy because women entered the labor force. Why did that increase occur? Because employers didn't have to just choose among white men as to who they employ. They could choose among a much bigger pool of labor, including women, including Black people. And so those increases in labor participation were a huge driver of productivity gains, and it could be the same in India. I think your question is a very apt one. The biggest thing that can happen to improve female labor force participation is to provide better childcare. It's very interesting if you look at what happens to women in the labor markets around the world. When women finish schooling, they enter the labor market and they earn more or less the same as men. But as soon as they have their first child, the pay gap diverges because women move to part-time work, because they drop out of the labor force for some period of time, and they never catch up with men. if we find a way to provide women with high quality, low cost childcare, we'll keep them in the labor market and we will benefit from the productivity gains that they provide. The other thing that really matters is the fact that women still carry an undue burden of unpaid work. So globally, women do about 2 hours every day of unpaid work more than men. And so the other thing I always say is it would help if men helped around the house a bit more. Helping with childcare, helping with domestic work. That is a huge factor in keeping women in the labor market.
Thank you. And to your point, one of the things that the Indian government has done, which you may know, is companies above a particular size have to provide access to creches. And we see this already making a very big difference in our own companies with women participating at work. Let me move to Mr. Mori now. One of the key things you touched upon was lost time for children during the pandemic, because many of them, especially in smaller towns, rural areas, did not have access to the internet or good quality internet. And you talked about the lifetime loss of over $1 trillion in income as well. Now, learning from this, what can be possible solutions to avoid something like this for children's education in the future should another pandemic hit us?
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. That's actually the $1 trillion questions, and we are struggling ourselves. And fundamentally what happened is that the mode of education, that the pedagogic systems right now that is going to require the physical presence to the schools, and the teachers educated in a certain way may have to be changed one way or the other. And the teacher may have to become more of a facilitator rather than teacher themselves. And then also, for any kind of disasters, any kind of crisis, the anticipation and preparation is everything. So therefore, that education system would probably need to start thinking about something like this will happen. So we train the teachers, we train the delivery mechanisms, and we may have to really start working on the digital platform, but not just simply copying the existing textbook into PDF. They need to think about very much different the curriculum delivery systems. Number three, I think it's one more. I think that this is not necessarily the World Bank and the policy, or I think the role of parents becomes so important at home. And then there's a very good research. It's about reading, that the readers' children become also good readers. And then how, I'm a father of a small child, and then how the fathers and mothers can interact with at home, I think is going to make also quite a difference. But it's not easy. If you have answer, please let me know.
Well, we have time for one or two questions from the audience, so I can see a lot of questions. You, sir, have been very interested in asking questions in every session. So if you don't mind, I'll give a chance to a few others. If we still have time, I'll come to you. So why don't we start off here? The mic is right next to you.
My name is Anil Honda. Here in India, we have got subsidy and quota. So how do you look at it, like in the social contract?
How do you look at subsidies and quotas within the context of social contracts?
I think you got my point. We have reservations for
Reservation, subsidy, and quotas.
Yeah.
How do you look at that in a social contract?
Okay, I'm not quite sure that what you mean by subsidies and quota.
subsidies and products and services which are given to the economically lower class of quota for the gender and both. Yeah.
Subsidies and quotas. And then I think there's a different way of thinking, but the bank has a bias toward that those financial assistance should go first to more the consumer side rather than business side. Having said that, that's not necessarily because it's banks and the intention about paying attention to the poorest of the poor. There are, you have to think about stimulus packages. We did finance that the MSME support the big, I think, for the $500 million. So from the point of view of keeping the poorest of the poor from becoming destitution situation, I think that the transfer payment, we call it, should go to the poor first, and they need to be able to sustain their matters. And if they have the room for other economic possibilities, we can think about some other matters. Now, the exception is that this MSMEs, once again, those are the huge part of the employment generation. So if the MSMEs collapses, then the employee is going to have also very difficult time. So we need to analyze how the shock is hitting, which segment of the sector, and then come up with good programs. But the bias is, I think, that going to go to the poor first, possibly with good targeting, but targeting itself is not necessarily always easy, especially when the shock comes, the foods get shocked. It's not the easy things to find out. So we can talk about something generic about it, but when it comes to like some specific shocks, I think we have to do a bit more studies. I hope I answered the question.
Let's take one last question. Yeah, the youngster over here.
Sorry, that was very loud. Hello, my name is Mihir. I am an alum
that reached England right directly.
That did, in fact, yeah. So I am an alum of Madam Minusha's institution, and I have a question for her as well, specifically. So, ma'am, you spoke about UBI very briefly, and ultimately it is a means of redistribution. So why would you, what reason would you dismiss UBI as maybe a legitimate form of re-establishing social contracts?
Yeah. So there has been a lot of enthusiasm about universal basic income. And the idea is that you give everyone a fixed amount that is given in an untargeted way to every individual to provide some social protection. And there are a couple of reasons why I'm not so keen on that. First is that you either give a very, very small amount that's meaningless, or if you're going to give a serious amount, which will actually provide people significant social protection, you would have to raise the rate of taxation in the economy by like 20% of GDP, which would be a huge amount. And then you would raise those taxes to redistribute lots of income to a lot of people who don't really need it. And so unless you're in a country, and I've worked on universal, on cash transfer schemes in many countries when I used to run the UK's aid program. If you're in a country like Malawi, where 90% of the people are below the poverty line, universal basic income is fine because most people are poor. And so it makes sense. You don't really, targeting is kind of a waste of time. But in any country that has the capacity to target, it's very hard to justify raising lots of taxes to redistribute income to a significant number of people who don't need it. That's the kind of economic argument. I think the philosophical problem I have with universal basic income is that in every society, part of the social contract is that if you are an able-bodied adult, you should contribute to society in exchange for being looked after when you're young, when you're old, and when you're sick. And I feel like it's a fundamental violation of a social contract to not ask everyone to contribute. It's almost like giving up on people and saying, you have nothing to add to this society. There's nothing you can do that can be useful. And so we're just going to pay you to stay home. And so that's the philosophical reason. I think you can do much better than that. I think India's employment guarantee scheme is better than that. I think many countries have targeted cash transfer schemes, or even better, what's called earned income tax credit, where you work in the labor market, you earn a wage, and if your wage is low such that you can't achieve a decent standard of living with that wage, or perhaps you have children and you can't support them, society gives you a tax credit, or what the previous speaker might have called a subsidy, but it tops up your income so that you can achieve a decent standard of living while still working and making a contribution to society. So I think there are much better alternatives.
Thank you. We have run out of time. So as the session comes to an end, please join me in thanking both our guests, not only for their time, but for their insightful views as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. We close the session with that, and the next two sessions are in the Crystal Room. Please join us there.